Hello once again. Kindly please settle down. To introduce our next presenter, may I call on stage the Director of the Center for Theology, Religious Studies, and Ethics, Professor Joel Sagut.
Thank you, Dr. Good afternoon once again, and I hope we are all settled to continue with our session this afternoon. So it is my honor to present to you our third speaker for the afternoon. Professor Jove Jim Aguas is a professor of philosophy here in the university, and I think we have with us some of his students. And he is also affiliated to the Center for Theology, Religious Studies, and Ethics. Professor Aguas is the executive convener of the Philippine National Philosophical Research Society, and he is the editor-in-chief of Philosophia, an international journal of philosophy. His notable publications include Person, Action, and Love, the Philosophical Thoughts of John Paul II, or Karol Wojtyła. This was published in 2014. And his recent among his recent publications is a chapter in Philosophies of Appropriated Religions, Perspectives from Southeast Asia, published by Springer. The title of the chapter is A Critical Look at Religious Diversity and Responding to Its Challenges. We have a long list of accomplishments and engagements of Dr. Aguas, but given that we now run short of our time, please just allow me to call him on stage to present to us his lecture, St. Albert the Great, the Universal Doctor's Relevance to Science. Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome Professor Dr. Jove Jim Aguas.
Thank you very much, Professor Sagat, for that kind introduction. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share this rather long paper. It's actually 18 pages, so I'll be skipping some of this. Hope you will not slip through the presentation. All right. Introduction. St. Albert the Great is regarded as one of the most universal thinkers during the Middle Ages. Because of his encyclopedic mind, he was called the Great, even in his lifetime. While his main interests are in theology and philosophy, he was also greatly interested in the natural science, and devoted a great deal of his time and attention to the actual empirical study of the relationships between attributes and natural subjects. Thus, he also made contributions to meteorology, mineralogy, and zoology, among others. He believed that Aristotle, in his brand of natural philosophy, did not present obstacles to the development of a Christian philosophical vision of the natural order. Pope Benedict XVI, in his general audience on March 24, 2010, said, "Indeed, with a glance at the titles of his very numerous works, we realize that there was something miraculous about his culture, in that his encyclopedic interest led him not only to concern himself with philosophy and theology, likewise other contemporaries of his, but also with every other discipline then known, from physics to chemistry, from astronomy to mineralogy, from botany to zoology." While he inherited astronomy as part of this classic curriculum of the Middle Ages, known as quadrivium, his interest in the science was not only speculative, as he was also interested in using mathematical calculations and conferring with astronomical tables to study the nature of celestial bodies. During his years in Cologne, St. Albert undertook experiments in physics and chemistry in his makeshift laboratory, and his reputation as a scientist grew. However, despite his significant contributions to the advancement of science and scientific learning, and despite being proclaimed the patron saint of scientists, he remains an obscure figure among scientists and even philosophers of science, and his ideas remain relatively understudied. It is, therefore, the aim of this paper to highlight the relevance of the contribution of this great scholastic theologian, philosopher, and scientist, who was given the title Doctor Universalis to science and scientific learning. Time and life of St. Albert the Great. Just to give you a portrait of the man. St. Albert's interests ranged from natural science all the way to theology, way more than his famous student, St. Thomas Aquinas. He made contributions to logic, psychology, metaphysics, meteorology, mineralogy, and zoology. He was a tireless commentator in nearly all the great authorities during the 13th century, and he was deeply involved in an attempt to understand the import of the thought of Aristotle in an organized manner, that he exerted efforts to paraphrase and make commentaries on all available works of Aristotle. Such an effort to organize the works of Aristotle was distinct from the Arab commentators. Those of you who are studying philosophy, you must be familiar with Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Al-Ghazal, etc., who had incorporated their studies into the study of Aristotle. However, he also showed appreciation of the Arab commentators by using some of their outstanding in developing his ideas in philosophy. His superior understanding of the diversity of philosophical texts allowed him to construct one of the most remarkable syntheses in medieval culture. He was born into a knightly family, being the eldest son of the Count of Bolstadt. Some place his birth around the year 1200 or 1205 or 1206 in Lauingen in Swabia, Germany. He joined the recently founded Order of Preachers around 1222 or 1223 while a student at the University of Padua through the invitation of Jordan of Saxony, the one who succeeded St. Dominic as the master of the order, whose preaching was remarkably effective in encouraging students to join the order. So it's been the practice of the Dominicans to recruit from the students in the university. His family opposed his decision to enter the Dominican order. He was then sent to Cologne in order to complete his training for the order. He finished this training as well as a course of studies in theology by 1228. And then he began teaching as a lector in many Dominican houses of studies in Cologne. And then he lectured on the sentences of Peter Lombard. The sentences of Peter Lombard, this is a summary of the theological treatises or thesis in theology. Then at Hildesheim, Fribourg, Regensburg, and Strasbourg. Sometime between 1241 and 1242, St. Albert was sent to the University of Paris to complete his theological education. And while studying, he was also lecturing on the sentences of Peter Lombard. He also started writing his 6-part Summa Parisiennes, dealing with the sacraments of the church, the incarnation and resurrection of Christ, the human nature, among other topics. And then in 1245, he received his degree as a Master of Theology and began to teach theology at the university. Around this year, St. Thomas Aquinas was sent to Paris to study under him. St. Thomas was under his direction for the next 3 years. In 1248, St. Albert was appointed Regent of Studies at the Studium Generale. That was newly created by the Dominican Order in Cologne. And in Cologne, he will start his scientific experiments. St. Albert, along with St. Thomas and other students, left Paris and went to Cologne. And St. Thomas continued his studies under Albert the Great in Cologne and also served as a Magister Studium in the school until 1252. Then St. Thomas returned to Paris to take up his teaching duties, while St. Albert remained in Cologne, where he began to work on the vast project of paraphrasing each of the known works of Aristotle. In 1254, he was elected the Prior Provincial of the German-speaking province of the Dominican Order, he being a German. This position mandated that St. Albert spend more time traveling throughout the province, visiting Dominican convents, priories, and even the Dominican mission in Riga. In this post, he attended with great care to Dominican friars' needs in 36 priories, together with many monasteries of Dominican nuns in Germany, Austria, Belgium, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. This task occupied St. Albert until 1256. That year, he returned to Cologne, but left the same year for Paris in order to attend the general chapter of his order, wherein the controversy regarding the position of the mendicants to teach in the university was being challenged. It was a controversy during the time. Some of the secular professors were questioning whether these mendicants, friars, the Franciscans, and the Dominicans have the right to teach in the university. While engaged in this controversy, St. Albert completed his refutation of Averroistic psychology with his De Unitate Intellectus contra Averroistas. He afterward departed for another tour of the province of Germany. In 1257, he was relieved of his duties as a provincial and returned again to Cologne as regent of studies. He continued to teach until 1259 and discussed the curriculum of this classic program used by the order together with St. Thomas Aquinas and Pietro di Tarantasia, who would later become Pope Innocent V. In 1260 to 62, St. Albert was consecrated bishop of the church and then sent to Ratisbon in order to undertake reforms of abuses in that diocese. 1263, Pope Urban IV relieved him of his duties and asked him to preach the crusade in the German-speaking countries, a duty he performed until 1264. I'll skip some of this. In 1274, while he was traveling to the Council of Lyons, Albert received the sad news of the untimely death of his favorite student, St. Thomas Aquinas, his friend and former student of many years. After the council, St. Albert returned to Germany, and in 1277, he traveled back to Paris to defend St. Thomas' teaching, which was under attack at the university when the Bishop of Paris, Stephen Tempier, planned to condemn the teachings of St. Thomas. That's another controversial event. In the last 3 years of his life, he lost his control of his intellectual faculties, and on November 15, 1280, he died. He died in his cell at the convent of the Holy Cross in Cologne, and he was buried there. I will skip some parts. Now, let's go to the science part. So I discussed the philosophical endeavors of St. Albert, but I think I can just share this with my philosophy students. I'll go to the science part because, of course, you are the science students. I hope they are still here. This is of interest to them. The start of science during the Middle Ages. In order to understand and appreciate the contributions and relevance of St. Albert the Great to science, we need to know the nature and status of science during the Middle Ages, vis-a-vis how the Middle Ages was viewed by thinkers after this period, namely the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the contemporary times. When Isaac Newton remarked that if he was able to see a little further, it was because he was standing on the shoulders of giants, people assumed that he meant by it that his scientific achievements were built on the discoveries of his predecessors, one of which was a French philosopher and mathematician, René Descartes. Few people, however, are aware that such aphorism was first coined in the 12th century by the theologian Bernard of Chartres, and that Newton's science has its roots embedded in the science of the Middle Ages. While we can say that science flourished during the Renaissance, it is not accurate to say that there was no advancement in science during the Middle Ages. The negative perception of Middle Ages science. The Middle Ages have always been portrayed negatively to the point that the term medieval was coined to mean old, barbaric, and passé. Medieval, the term medieval, is synonymous with darkness. It is a term of disparagement from the beginning. It was invented in the 15th century by the Italian humanists who believed that they were bringing about a rebirth, a renaissance of the ancient and better culture of the Greeks and the Romans, whom they called the classic or the classical period, which means, yes, old, but timeless. After a the medieval, or intervening period of the barbarians or barbarism, the Dark Age. According to the humanists, the ancient Roman Empire had been destroyed by barbarian invaders, such as the Goths and the Vandals. And the humanists called the culture of the Middle Ages Gothic, to suggest its barbarian origin. They ignored and undermined the medieval scholarship on the grounds that it was convoluted and written in barbaric Latin. This negative view was further maintained by English philosophers such as Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke, who were critical of scholasticism, the main philosophy during the Middle Ages. Locke was critical of scholasticism, viewing it as a rigid and dogmatic approach to knowledge. For Hobbes, it was a threat to reason and intellectual freedom and promoted absurdities and meaningless ideas like substantial forms. Bacon argued that scholastics ignored empirical evidence and relied instead on abstract speculation. During the Enlightenment period, Voltaire and his fellow philosophers continued attack against medieval philosophy and lauded progress in reason and science during their period. For them, during the Enlightenment, reason fulfilled its promise of bringing its light to dispel the darkness caused by superstition, which means religion, during the medieval period or Middle Ages. They needed a narrative to show that mankind was moving forward towards progress after the Dark Ages of medieval period. Through a mechanistic view of the world, the Enlightenment thinkers advanced the idea of the universe as a machine that functions by natural and predictable laws. Although God was created the world, He does not interfere in its activities. Religious doctrines, therefore, have no place in the understanding of the physical and human world. All this put the Middle Ages, especially the church, which was influential during that period, in a bad light. According to Voltaire, medieval philosophy is a bastard daughter of Aristotle's philosophy, badly translated and understood. The great weight of the assault of the Middle Ages carried on to the 20th century. Popular historians based their work on previous popular histories and perpetuated the myth that the period was an interruption to mankind's progress. Middle Ages contribution to science. The pushback to this negative view happened some 100 years ago with the work of a French physicist, mathematician, historian, Pierre Duhem. Duhem wrote extensively on the history of science, particularly on the development of physics and mathematics in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. His work in this area helped to challenge the traditional view of the scientific revolution as a sudden and radical break with the past. In his earlier work, he described the Middle Ages as scientifically sterile. However, while researching on unrelated matter, he came across a vast body of unread medieval scripts, one of which was the unusual reference to the then unknown medieval thinker Jordanus de Nemore. His pursuit of this reference and the research to which it led is widely acknowledged to have created the field of the history of medieval science. Thus, when he wrote his work, Origin of Statics, in 1904, he included a number of chapters of medieval science. One treated Jordanus de Nemore. What Duhem found in these manuscripts amazed him, as he quickly realized that science in the Middle Ages had been sophisticated, highly regarded, and essential to later developments. His work was carried forward by the American Lynn Thorndike, one of my sources, and the German analyst Mayer, who refined and expanded it. And as scholars explore more manuscripts, they reveal achievements of the natural philosophers of the Middle Ages that are ever more remarkable. Recent research have revealed that the Middle Ages was a period of enormous advances in science, technology, and culture. The compass, paper, printing, stirrups, and gunpowder all appeared in Western Europe between the 6th and 16th centuries. And although these inventions originated in the Far East, Europeans developed them to a far higher degree than had been the case elsewhere. The compass allowed Christopher Columbus to navigate across the Atlantic Ocean. The development of printing and paper made for millions of books to be printed in the first 50 years after Johann Gutenberg published the first Bible in 1455. The people of medieval Europe invented spectacles, the mechanical clock, the windmill, and the blast furnace by themselves. Lenses and cameras, almost all kinds of machinery, and the Industrial Revolution itself all owe their origins to the forgotten inventors of the Middle Ages. And if we don't know their names, it does not mean that their achievements need not be recognized. But the most significant contribution of the Middle Ages is that it laid the foundation of modern science in Western civilization. Hence, it's not true that there was no science before the Renaissance. Once the medieval scholars studied the Greek classical works, those of Aristotle and Plato and company, they developed systems of thought and concepts that propagated science and allowed it to expand and spread. For one, the universities that were established during the 12th century provided scientific research a fertile ground to grow and bear fruits. Christian theology encouraged the study of the natural world because it is considered to be God's creation. Today, when we talk of science, we picture a laboratory where scientists and researchers carry out their experiments. Science is known today as a systematic and structured approach to acquiring knowledge about the natural world through observation, experimentation, and evidence-based reasoning. However, during the medieval period, the word science has a much broader meaning. The word science comes from scientia, which means knowledge. And science encompasses all intellectual disciplines, including philosophy, theology, and politics. Theology was considered, of course, the mother of all sciences. And the study of nature or the natural world is considered a separate science called natural philosophy. So the study of science during the medieval period in the modern or contemporary times is very much different. Modern science, as we have mentioned, is through observation, experimentation, and evidence-based or inductive reasoning. It is positivistic and naturalistic, which means that it focuses on the concrete and physical, thus leaving no room for the supernatural. But from the beginning of the 19th century, science has excluded God from the laboratory. In contrast, medieval natural philosophy, or the science of the natural world, has placed God at the center of any considerations of nature because He is the creator of everything, including the natural or the physical world. Science during the Middle Ages. However, what kind of natural philosophy or science of nature was in place during the Middle Ages? During the 11th and 12th centuries, the study of nature was greatly influenced by the Timaean model based on the reading of Plato's Timaeus, the dialogue Timaeus. This Timaean approach to nature, harmonized with the Augustinian theology, was characterized by this mythical purpose to discover in the order of the visual cosmos the vestiges and images of the invisible God, so as to lead the human mind and heart to rest in Him alone. Its outcome was wonder and praise of the beauty of God manifested in nature. But in the middle of the 12th century, a number of new astronomical, alchemical, and other scientific works translated from Arabic and Greek sources, which revealed another side of Platonism, the mathematical or Pythagorean method in investigating scientific phenomenon. So in the early part of the Middle Ages, the science was purely Platonic, or Neoplatonic to be more specific. But along these works reflecting the Platonic tradition, there was also transmitted a vast Aristotelian and sometimes false Aristotelian corpus, whose very different orientation was not immediately perceived, especially because the Arabian commentators, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Averroes, were inclined to harmonize Aristotle and Plato. So they cannot distinguish which one is Plato's and which one is Aristotle's. Now, St. Albert the Great. St. Albert the Great and St. Thomas Aquinas, as we know, studied the philosophy of the works of Aristotle. So they followed the philosophy of Aristotle. Of course, together with other Greek works available at the time. They were the two leading figures in the 13th century who were influential in theology, philosophy, and science. Thus, it is customary and natural to couple their names, always Aquinas, Albert the Great, or St. Thomas, St. Albert the Great. Besides being members of the same orders, they were master and student. They were also two scholars of their times who did most to adapt to the natural philosophy of Aristotle's Christian use, a fact which in itself suggests their interest in natural science. It may seem strange that the two theologians who were members of an order vowed to asceticism, apostolic poverty, and the maintenance of strict orthodoxy against heresy should play a leading part in interpreting the ideas of Greek and Arabic philosophers and display a keen interest in natural science. But that is a fact. They are, like Father Nick a while ago, they were priest scientists. All right. Albert the Great as scientist, and this is very interesting, just to wake you up. St. Albert's reputation as a scientist is based on two reasons. First, he examined and treated various topics that can be considered as parts of the natural sciences, like chemistry, botany, zoology, mechanics, astronomy. Second, he had a real scientific temperament because he based his research on observation, incorporating other researchers' results when he is sure of their validity, and he never sought to infer more than scientific data than possible. For his scientific works, he is considered to be one of the first scientists from the West, and arguably the greatest biologist since Aristotle. My bias. He devoted his tireless energies, even as a bishop, to the pursuit of scientific truth in nature, and he insisted on the indispensability of scientific truth, and indeed of all philosophical truth for sound theology, meaning the science of God's special revelation to man. St. Albert was also responsible for anticipating by several centuries some of our more recent discoveries. His writings included alchemy, of course, no alchemy no more, anthropology, architecture, astronomy, botany, climatology, chemistry, so many to mention. In his youth, before he became a master, St. Albert loved the study of science. He was very observant, particularly with regard to nature, and he always saw, loved, and taught the natural in the context of the supernatural. He has the gift of acute powers of observation, and when he traveled in the different parts of Europe, as we have mentioned, he always recorded extensively what he has observed in order not to miss anything that is worth seeing. He recorded details of fish in the Danube River, cattle, deer, birds, forests, squirrels, and plants. Of particular interest were St. Albert's observations on insects, since there were no available studies in this type of animal. He traveled great distances to examine various metals in mining districts, along which he mentions as particularly important Fribourg, Goslar, and the Harz Mountains in Lower Saxony. He also described surface mining of gold, which he observed in the Elbe and Rhine rivers. His endeavors included building up a collection of plants, insects, and chemical compounds. And he not only observed animal life, but also performed experiments on them. He and his associates have proved by experiment that a cicada goes on singing in its breast for a long time after its head has been cut off. Ganun pala yun. And that a turtle, although a marine animal, would not drink seawater unless possibly fresh water flowed into the sea by experimenting with a turtle in a vessel of water. During his years in Cologne, St. Albert the Great undertook experiments in physics and chemistry, and his makeshift laboratory. Well, I already mentioned this a while ago. Now, the task of natural science according to Albert the Great. For St. Albert, there was no distinction between what today might be called a philosophy of science or natural philosophy or natural science. The main task of such a science is the study of corpus mobile, meaning the body is subject to change, and known to us by rational reflection on our sense experience. The first task of natural science establishes its basic principles by arriving at a real definition of the subject of the corpus mobile, or changeable body, through an analysis of sensible experience and then demonstrating its most general properties. This is done through the process of abstraction. Those of you who are my students, you should know this. This real definition of corpus mobile, established by analytical insight or rational reflection into sense experience, serves as a general model for corpus mobile. So general that it is through it that we recognize the existence of any specific changeable body. The second task is to apply this general model based on basic principles and properties of a changeable body in analyzing every kind of natural or changeable body, proceeding from the most common features and descending to the ultimate species of things with their specific properties. Hence, for St. Albert the Great, the principles of natural science are not independent set of axioms, but they are reducible to a single fundamental principle, that is, the definition of corpus mobile. Corpus mobile applies to specific bodies that they undergo natural change, that is, as change results from the internal principles of matter and form. St. Albert the Great puts emphasis on experience and personal observation. In his works on animals and plants, he alludes to his personal experience or his associates' experience. He would often tell his students, I have tested this, or I have experienced this, or I and my associates have experienced this, or I have tested this to be true. In the Animalibus, when describing medicine and the health of birds, he said that the wise falconer will know what is beneficial to the health of birds based on experience, for experience is the best teacher in all matters of this sort. However, St. Albert the Great cannot be regarded just a mere empiricist who only relies on experiences and personal observation, because he also tests particular statements of particular accounts based on the general laws concerning living beings that he read in Aristotle or derived from his personal reflections. And I don't know if you can figure this out, that is actually a division of the natural sciences according to St. Albert the Great. It's too small. No? The main, yung nandito sa dulo, naturally changeable, that's the corpus mobile. So you can divide the study according to taas, according to general principles. According to general principles and universal properties, yung libro niya, yung physics, including the Indivisilibus. Okay? And then, you can also study mobile bodies as restricted by particular matter. And you can divide these two into simple bodies and mixed bodies. Under simple bodies, you can see the simple bodies can be changing in place or changing in form. Under changing in place, you have the cello, astronomy, degenerazione et corruptione, speculum. No? And then under changing forms, you have the generation and corruption, the natura locorum, the causes and properties of elements. Under mixed bodies, you have, in process of mixing, meteors. And then mixtures and compounds, inanimate and animate. Then animate, ando na. Animate yung living organisms na yan, living things. No? So, animate, the soul, principle of life, and then you can still divide that, soul's works, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very complicated. Now, he was able to make a diagram of all these because of his studies. Now, the scientific works of St. Albert the Great. In 1940, as I mentioned, He returned to Cologne together with St. Thomas Aquinas to establish a studium generale for the Dominican order. And as regents of the studies for his brethren, St. Albert had the responsibility not only to provide necessary theological studies, but also the philosophical preparation for such studies. Perhaps this new responsibility explains his decision to write a complete encyclopedia of philosophical disciplines based on the works of Aristotle. In the Physica, the first of the Aristotelian paraphrases composed by St. Albert the Great, he explains that his Dominican confreres had implored him for a good number of years to compose a book on physical science in such a way that they could maintain the whole of natural knowledge and thereby understand completely or competently the works of Aristotle. And he acceded to the request, and therefore, the first work that he did on science was the Physica, yung kaninang pinakita ko. No? I will skip some parts again. Sorry, napakarami nito eh. Medyo na-inspire kong magsulat kay St. Albert. Hindi naman obvious. The relevance of St. Albert. I think I have said enough to drive my point that St. Albert the Great is a great scientist of the medieval era. St. John Paul II, in many instances, has expressed his view on the relationship between science and faith, or between science and religion, in other messages and statements. His discourse given to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in November 1979 to commemorate the centenary of the birth of Albert Einstein. His discourse given in October 1986 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. His message on evolution addressed to the plenary session of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in October 1996, and encyclical Fides et Ratio, published in 1998. The underlying message focuses on establishing a climate of openness, dialogue, and cooperation between science and religion. St. John Paul further said that the Church defends the dignity and necessity of scientific and philosophical research to discover the still hidden secrets of the universe and to shed light on the nature of the human being. Hence, scientists and believers can form a great spiritual family and construct a culture which is genuinely searching for the truth. The spirit of collaboration and dialogue has already been established centuries ago during the Middle Ages. One influential figure in this collaboration and dialogue was the universal doctor, St. Albert the Great. He's a pioneer of the integration of faith and science. He believed that faith and reason, as exemplified in science, were complementary rather than contradictory, and that scientific inquiry could be a means of deepening one's understanding of God's creation. This approach had a lasting impact on the development of Catholic theology and the relationship between faith and science. For St. Albert, following Aristotle, the study of nature, as all the theoretical sciences, is available in itself, a part of that contemplative life in which human happiness is chiefly to be found. He echoes Aristotle's famous saying that even the viscera of worms are worth our study because in them is reflected the work of the divine artist. A few minutes lang, Neil. St. Albert the Great was one of the first scholars to recognize the importance of empirical observation and experimentation in scientific inquiry. He believed that scientific knowledge should be based on observation, experience, and reason, rather than solely on authority or tradition. This approach was revolutionary for its time and paved the way for later scientific developments. The significant contributions to various fields of science, including physics, is undeniable. And the legacy of St. Albert the Great as a scientist and philosopher has endured for centuries. His emphasis on empirical observation has inspired generations of scientists and philosophers. According to Pope Francis, St. Albert the Great's mind reminds us that there is friendship between science and faith, and that through their vocation to the study of nature, scientists can take an authentic and fascinating path to holiness. St. Albert the Great is recognized as a doctor of the Church by Pope Pius XII, who named him patron saint of enthusiasts of the natural sciences in 1931. And we celebrate his feast on November 15. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aguas.